Hi, everybody. Welcome. Um, just getting ready to start. We just want to make sure that we've got all the participants here. Going to give it another minute and then we'll get started. If there's anybody that should be a panelist but is in the participants list, you should be able to send a message to Abby and she can get you up in the panelist group. So send her a message if that's the case. So I think I'll go ahead and get started, and we've got most folks on right now. My name is Jessica Reichers, and I'm the manager for the technology and policy section at the Department of Energy. My group is largely responsible for the development of this energy strategy. I just want to welcome all of you here today. I don't know if any of you might have tuned into the advisory group meeting earlier. So this might be a very long day of meetings for a few of you, but we appreciate the time to come here and participate. My role during this will be to kind of monitor the chat and help facilitate discussion and conversations. And to that end, just a couple sort of helpful things as we move through this. One is we do have sort of a very unwieldy mixture of discussions here around transmission and distribution because we're including both electricity and natural gas, recognizing that those two things have very different functions and needs. It may seem odd to have these together, but this was really a matter of timing and staff resources. And so we put this together. There are some overlap in the discussions around them, but we do recognize that there might be parts of the meeting that are more applicable to you and your organization than others. And to that end, I think it's really helpful for us to use the chat feature for questions. I'll be monitoring that and keeping track of the questions that come in, looking for opportunities to group questions together so that we can move through readily and efficiently through the meeting process. Also, raising of hands when we have opportunities for questions is also helpful just to make sure that people have a moment to provide or get in line to be able to provide input. Just a couple things that I think are helpful as far as sort of helping to work together when we have such a big group that's online right now. One is just making sure we're following the agenda, that each of us is listening carefully and seeking to learn and understand each other's perspectives, to encourage respectful, candid, and constructive conversation, but also to keep an open mind as other people are talking. Asking questions to clarify and understand why are really important. And again, that's a really great place to add comments into the chat as soon as something is said that you need more clarification on. That way we make sure we address it. Try to be open, transparent, inclusive, and accountable to what's being said, and make sure that we're respecting different opinions. And really the thing about this group that's helpful is for us to do the it's us against the problem kind of thing. How do we work together to try and figure out a path forward, or where we have interests that we want to model certain things? Maybe there's alignment on those things that we could all come to agreement on. So be looking for those places where we can work together to solve a problem. Be conscious of your speaking time. If you're one of these people like me who tends to speak a lot, you might want to create some space for others to join in the conversation. And likewise, if you're one of those quieter folks, you might see if you want to throw something in the chat or raise your hand so that we can get you in the queue so that you can get an opportunity to share your perspective on things. So that's sort of the basic guidance that I wanted to throw out there for this. And then I'm going to hand this over to two members of my team who work a lot in the electricity and fuel space and are here to facilitate the conversation along with our technical contractor, CETI, Clean Energy Transition Institute, and the modeler, Jeremy Hargraves, who's from Energy. I get it all wrong. EER.
Energy Research.
Thank you. Thank you, Elaine. See, everybody has to help. So I'm going to pass this over first to Jason Searman and his colleague, Rob Delmar. They're going to walk us through some of the initial work of the strategy. When we get to Jeremy, that's a place where I really want to make sure Jeremy gets through all the slides because often questions you have will be addressed at some point. And that we will be getting the questions rounded up for when he's finished, and then we'll put them all together and get them out there. And then I do see that there's a chat comment from Jake Stevens. Jake, this is the only meeting of this individual group. We did have a first meeting with all of the working groups together, and we will have a wrap-up meeting on the 22nd with all of the working groups together again, where we put forward the proposal for a draft reference scenario. So, but for this small group, this was the only meeting for the small group. Okay, with that, I will hand it over to Jason. And if you have any questions, throw them in the chat. Thanks, Jason.
Jessica, can you hear me?
I can.
Oh, I was just pointing out that there's a phase 2 of this process, which is the policy and recommendations conversation, which will happen next year, where a lot of this conversation will continue. So this isn't the only time this group will probably meet or have input.
Thanks, Alan. Good point.
Okay. Thanks, everybody. So let's keep it here just to remind people that my name is Jason Searman. You'll see my colleague and friend Rob Delmar in a few minutes. He'll take over on a slide and we'll do introductions via chat at that point. We can go to the next slide. I'll just do a recap on how to use WebEx here. Maybe that next slide's helpful. But the bottom buttons have like your main control panel, your microphones down there, your video. You know, if you're asking a question, feel free to come off video. Like we said, queuing up your questions in the chat will be helpful. The chat button is down there on the right, you know, off to the far end of the right, little idea bubble coming out of the off the head of the mouth is your chat feature. You can raise your hand a few different ways down there. You can see the raise hand function at the bottom again. And then off to the right, if you like open up your chat window, you'll see probably chats and panelists pop up in different ways on the right-hand side. And once you find your panelist icon for yourself, there's a raise hand feature embedded alongside that spot too. So I think that covers off the basics. If you have any technical issues or, you know, maybe need a hand, just come offline and speak if you really need help and can't figure anything out. Otherwise, you could chat Abby Reeser. She's another colleague at Odo here, and she's going to help with technical questions. So hopefully you can see her name pop up in the panelist bar on your right. Let's move on to the next slide.
Jason, can I just add that it would be great if everybody could turn on their camera so we feel like we're in this virtual meeting room together.
Yeah, we could do that.
It needs to turn off every once in a while, but
sure, let's do that right now. I was going to remind people of that in a second, but go for it. Everybody can come off and see our smiling faces. Let's go to the next slide though. So yeah, here the purpose of the work group you know, we're in this first phase, as Alan just mentioned, which is the modeling phase. So we're trying to understand foundational data sources expected to inform the starting point for analysis and ask clarifying questions relating to this modeling aspect. That's kind of the main point of this meeting. Jeremy's going to do a great job in a few minutes, kind of going through step by step, walking us from kind of top to bottom or bottom to top, his methodology for modeling, the assumptions, and how the mechanics of everything works. So the other aspects of this meeting are to engage with these subject matter experts. You know, everybody's dialed in and on the phone participating. Thanks for being here. Thanks for taking time onto your day. I'll walk through our list of participants here in a second, but we're relying on all your subject matter expertise to provide feedback on these key assumptions related to basically the transmission and distribution systems for both the natural gas system and the electricity system. So that's wires and pipes out to mid-century. And then later on, after we go through the mechanics of the methodology and what all the modeling is about and talk about our reference case scenario, the second big takeaway for this meeting is to kind of brainstorm a little bit around what if scenarios and what these alternative scenarios are that we're going to be modeling. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a few minutes. So next slide. I think is our agenda. Just a reminder of our agenda for the next slide. Let's flip through that. We're doing pretty good on time here. I should be done talking very soon, and we'll switch it to Jeremy, but we've got some good chunks of time for Jeremy, about half an hour basically for Jeremy to talk through the mechanics and the methodology and the starting assumptions, then another half an hour roughly for walking through assumptions related to the key reference scenario. And then, like I said, these what if questions are going to be kind of the last thing we talk about for half an hour about, you know, what are the different levels and dials we can turn in response to concerns about, you know, maybe certain technologies or what ifs, like if certain things are harder, longer lead time items, maybe harder to deploy, different stages of maturity, different levels of the grid, you know, distribution system versus transmission system and things like that. And then we'll wrap up and go over our next steps. So let's take a look at who all is with us today. The next slide has our roster. Let's go to the next slide. Just remind everybody who all is on the call. So we have a diverse group here. We have, just go back one just for everybody's benefit, just to look at it for a little bit. Obviously, the participants are on the right again in our WebEx platform. You can scroll up and see who's here. Probably quite a few people beyond the scope of our prime roster here, but this is our prime roster of participants for this transmission and distribution working group. Thanks for everybody again for taking time out of the day and being here. It's great to have, you know, an assortment of folks from our transmission providers down to our utilities at the local level, consumer-owned utilities, investor-owned utilities, power purchasers, power providers. Great group here, so probably couldn't ask for a better assortment of folks. So looking forward to hearing what everybody has to say. Let's go to the next slide and kick it over to Jeremy to maybe walk through his team, which includes the CETI group and Evolved Energy and some other independent consultants. Thanks, Jeremy.
Jason. Hi, everyone. I'm Jeremy Hargreaves. I'm a principal at Evolved Energy Research, and I'm leading up the technical modeling part of this project. I am part of a larger team, as Jason described. On the call today, we have Eileen, who is the overall project manager from CETI, as well as Elaine Hart from Moment Energy Insights and Angela Long from Rockcrest Consulting. And then there's other members of our team that are not on the call today, but are playing different roles on the project, and they're listed here as well.
Hello all. I'm going to use this slide to introduce myself. I'm Rob Delmar. I work with Jessica's team at Oregon Department of Energy, and I will be helping to facilitate the discussion around the distribution system in today's meeting and moving forward into the state energy strategy. So we ask that you introduce yourself via chat with your name, your affiliation, the geographic location you represent, if there is a specific geographic location that you represent, and as just an icebreaker question, what's your favorite summer activity? And so with that, I think we can jump to the next slide.
Okay, thanks for folks for doing some icebreakers with us in the chat. Here we are. We're going to set the stage on just some background and level setting of where we're at in the process. So we can go to the next slide, please. So we're essentially in phase one is a way to think about the left-hand side of this slide, our technical approach, which is highlighted in orange here. That's the current phase we're in. It'll take us to the end of the year. This has like lots of different groups in this phase. We're in a working group right now. We've got 8 other working groups that are meeting currently. The last working group meeting will huddle up all the individual work groups. There are like 8 different subject matter specific working groups. And so they've been meeting on their own over the past week or two. And then they're going to each meet in a big meeting on August 22nd. The purpose of these work groups are to inform the modeling. So we're going to be providing information on the data sources we're using, and we're asking for feedback on key assumptions. That's all happening here in this phase. The goal of the working groups, as a reminder, are not necessarily to come to a consensus or conclusion on any given assumption or scenario. We're mostly here to hear views, input, recommendations on where relevant information sources might exist. We'll talk through some data assumptions, but there could be other sources of data that might be quickly able for Jeremy could quickly maybe review and might be able to include in his modeling. So that's just an example of something that could come out of this phase. Let's see. In evaluating what we hear, we're going to applying some decision-making guideposts. We plan to use the best available information and have been working with data holders to understand that context so far. The model must produce results that we're going to meet our climate goals. I'll talk a little bit about those on the next, let's see, 2 more slides from now. But when we get into phase 2, just a reminder, that's kind of where we'll talk more about the qualitative issues that might be related to some technology choices and trade-offs and things like that. So, and a reminder on the final report, that's next year, next November. So the modeling that we're doing now, we're going to try to get running. That's what another main goal is. These modeling efforts take time. And so there's going to be a reference case in 5 alternative scenarios that we need to have time for the modeling to work through. So by the time that's done, then we'll have those results, which will help us, you know, give us a baseline for these discussions on policy recommendations and trade-offs and the kind of the qualitative assessment phase. And then, of course, the final report writing. So that's probably a good recap on this slide of where we're at and where we're going. Let's go to the next slide. And just a reminder on kind of all the different topics that we're charged with addressing basically and talking about with our stakeholders in these meetings and in phase 2, and ultimately what goes in our report to the legislature. I don't know if I need to read through all these, but I'm happy to kind of like give some flavors. You know, we've got our clean energy and climate policies that we need to hit. So I'll walk through those quickly to give everybody a refresher of what we're driving towards. But the House bill that charged us with this gave us a lot of other factors to assess in our scope. And so this is just an example of those. Environmental justice, community benefits, land use considerations are certainly at the top of mind. You know, the costs of certain resources, what their capacity factors are, where they're located, how easy they are to develop, you know, what the challenges are, what the implications and impacts of those development concerns are for folks that live in those areas, wherever those resources might be located. That's a huge concern. So we're all working together to try to do our best, and we'll see how phase 2 can help us talk through those things a little bit more if we can't necessarily get them modeled into the quantitative phase we're in right now. Okay, let's go to those policy objectives I've been reminding folks of. That's our next slide. These are like, basically, Jeremy might be able to talk a little bit more about how his modeling aggregates resources to account for this, but this is essentially what we're optimizing for in the model. This is these are the requirements that have to be met. So we had Executive Order 2004. Not sure what year that was. It was maybe right before the pandemic, but that was our prior governor. Her executive order that was 80% greenhouse gas reduction by 2050. That encouraged a lot of state agencies to kind of do as much as they could on climate change and reducing greenhouse gases. Then in 2021, we passed House Bill 2021. So that's our 100% clean electricity standard. There's some interim milestones there, 80% by 2030 and 90% by 2035. But that applies basically to our two largest investor-owned utilities in Oregon. That's what an IOU is, and that is Portland General Electric and PacifiCorp. And then we have natural gas, liquid fuels, and propane climate goals, and that is essentially Oregon Department of Environmental Quality's climate protection program, and that program aims to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 90% by 2050. And then I'm not the expert on our clean fuels programs and things, but if there are questions of those that pop up, or if folks would like to delve into the nuances of that, we probably have people on our team that can speak to that. Next slide.
Hey, Jason, this is a good spot. Actually, I'm going to jump in because Jake had an important question.
Sure.
So Jake asked if HB 2021 will be modeling the 80% and 90% milestones as binding hard targets. Yeah, the assumptions going into the model is that the state will achieve the goals of HB 2021, not only the 2040, but not only the 80% by 2030, but the 90% by 2035 and 100% by 2040. So yes, all three would be included as the assumptions across the reference scenario and the other scenarios as well.
And the same goes for the CPP that will be adopted in December.
Thanks, Jason.
Yeah. And I don't know if we can just spend too much time on this slide either, but it's a good reminder of what we're doing with this reference or core scenario. I think if you call it a core scenario, this graphic makes even more sense because it's in the middle, just like the core of an apple. But essentially, in modeling, you want to establish some benchmark or reference scenario. Otherwise, if you don't have something that is kind of concrete and stable, and you moved everything around, then it's going to be really hard to understand the cause and effects of those changes. And so your reference scenario kind of serves as that core comparison case of business as usual. People have lots of different names for them. They all have pitfalls, kind of semantics at some point. But the bottom line is this is kind of a reference scenario, and that makes a lot of sense because it'll be used to refer and compare these alternative scenarios to. And then you can, by having that reference scenario, you'll be able to see what the tweaks you'd made in one bucket. Maybe you tweaked a few different buckets or levers or dials of different factors that are, building into this model. And that then changes the results of the model. And so we'll get at least 5. I think that's pretty set number, but we have basically 5 bites at the apple, continue with my apple analogy, to deviate from that core scenario. So any questions on that? I think we can probably circle back to questions about just the mechanics of what we're doing here, but that hopefully level sets everybody. I see this question about a do nothing reference case. I don't know if it's do nothing, and business as usual also is probably not the best words. It's like all the policies that exist today are baked into this reference scenario. So definitely not a do nothing. It's like if we do everything and we don't really tip the scales in preference of certain technologies over others, maybe for some of those qualitative reasons that we'll discuss more in phase 2, then this is what we get, or this is what the model selects, just based on, you know, I don't know, I was about to say vanilla data points, but, you know, maybe baseline or like reference data points that are, you know, nationally used or like common to a lot of different studies. You know, this is what the lion's share of studies use, so that's what we used in this study. There could be different data sets, different dials. Maybe we do like a really high load growth scenario or something like that, but our reference case picked like a more middle of the road load growth scenario. So that's kind of what we mean when we say reference.
So Jason, can I jump in for a second? I see Jake has several questions. So one thing is, yes, I'll let people jump in and ask questions, but keep in mind that the next set of slides are really going to be going over to our modeler, who's going to give us a really good sense of things. But I do want to pause and just answer a couple questions that are being asked. Keeping in mind that the energy strategy is something that we're doing because the legislature asked us to do it in House Bill 3630. And our directive in that was to assess how Oregon can achieve its energy objectives. And those include House Bill 2021 electricity goals. That includes, as Alan mentioned, the climate protection program goals. And then we fall back to Executive Order 20-04, 80% below for anything that might not fall into those two areas. So that is what we were asked to do, and therefore a do nothing scenario wouldn't meet the obligations that we have in the bill. And then to Jake's question about the base case. So I'm trying to make sure that we understand that as part of the base case, existing state policies will be assumptions that go into that case. And we're not really calling it a base case. And I want people to be really clear on this. The reference scenario is not meant to highlight a future state. It is to be able to have something in which we can compare all the alternative scenarios against. So it will be a path to achieve all of those goals that we said, but it's not meant to be reflective of what is expected to happen by that date necessarily. So it's not policy determining, it is policy informing as far as what it's called. So we want to refer to it as the reference case and how all of these things will happen. So Jake, if you have a follow-up question that just gets at that, let's talk about it. But if it's about the modeling, let's get the modeler and have him do his thing before we jump into that.
Yeah, thanks. Jessica, if I might add that, well, the reference case models our success of our existing policies and laws. The scenarios then look at well, what if that doesn't happen? What if we get constrained transmission? What if we don't get as many heat pumps as we think we're going to get? What if we don't have as much electric vehicle adoption? So the scenarios are where those play out. And we compare those results back to the reference scenario, and it will allow us to then see the delta between the two, to see what happens if we don't do this or if we do this in the scenarios. And so we can then assess the trade-offs by these different things that happen in the scenarios. And in that sense, it'll inform us about the policy when we get to the policy section in next phase about what we want to do to meet our goals and adopt our energy strategy.
Yeah, thanks. And that's understood. So all of my questions are directed at how are we going to model it and what the initial conditions are. And I've got a degree in mathematics and MBA in finance and 15 years of modeling and studying energy performance and interconnection and transmission and stuff. So our comments are focused on that. But we had a slide that had a couple of things on it there. I still just don't think it's well defined what the energy policies are we're modeling. Like, you know, are you going to model the RPS? What about the small energy standard for 10% from sub 20 megawatt renewables? What about the state's PURPA standards? You know, what about the actual policy statement in HB 2021? And I'm reading the statute that is the bill enabling this, which is, pathways to achieving the state's energy policy objectives, presumably the things that the legislature has statute, embodied in statute saying this is the policy of the state should be included. So we have these Section 2 policy things from HB 2021 that electricity generated in a manner that produces zero greenhouse gas emissions also be generated to the maximum extent practicable in a manner that provides additional direct benefits to communities in this state in the forms of creating and sustaining meaningful living wage jobs, promoting workforce equity, and increasing energy security and resiliency. So right now, for example, it's not clear to me whether you plan to omit that from the model entirely, or how you intend to address and solve for the maximum extent practicable, which I think would be helpful to understand which things are being omitted and be binding constraints in the model, or if there's some of these that are a little messier, how do we get at maximum extent practicable? How is that going to be approached? And so I'm hoping we can define that at the outset so we agree on what the model is trying to solve for, even before we get into the other inputs into it.
So, Jake, good questions. And I'm glad that you're here to, as I like to call it, get nerdy with us. I think it's more important that we wait to address these until after the modeler covers what the model is going to do. And then to your point, exactly all the things that you're flagging are things that we want to be able to discuss as part of the modeling input. So you're getting to where we're trying to get the conversation to. So let's have Jeremy go through his model, and then we'll come back to your questions. And if questions are coming up, keep throwing them in the chat like you've been doing so that we can get them there in place. We don't forget anything.
But is that a modeler question, or is that a Odo as the director and manager of the project question? Like, have you decided what laws are going to be included in here or not? Because it doesn't seem like it's all of them at the initial presentation. So I'm trying to address that directly, not put it behind the model, because that's sort of the front end question, not the back end question.
Well, it's not a back end question in that it is what the inputs go into the model. And to your point, there were a couple of things I heard in there. Let me just point back to them, but I really want us to get to hearing about the model so that we don't lose time in that space for everybody to come up to speed. But to your point, couple things. The RPS compliance is looped into now sort of the compliance standards that are going with the 80, 90, and 100%. If you have data that shows that we won't cover RPS compliance by getting to the 80%, 90%, and 100% of HB 2021, we want to hear that in the feedback about the modeling.
That's a separate, that's not a correct assumption. The PUC has said the utilities literally don't have to track the RECs associated with any of that. And so there is a separate law that provides a floorboard that requires REC compliance that is not covered by HB 2021 necessarily.
It's totally separate. You're right. But the point being that we need to have data to be able to have the model show what that looks like. And I can't tell you exactly how the RPS is modeled in the model, but Jeremy can. So we want to get him in here to be able to have that coverage. The other piece that you asked, we have asked Jeremy, and he's ready to talk to you about how we can model the renewable energy goals that you mentioned. So that's in there, ready for discussion.
Thanks. I'll pause, but I think the basic request is you giving us a clear list of these are the laws we are going to include or not include. I would presume that's Odo's scope, and that should be transparent to everybody involved here, so that we're not omitting something. And whatever the presumptions were, that was a great example of we should know if it is or isn't, so we can make sure we come out of the gate correctly, or if there's a dispute about whether something is or isn't in here, that we address it up front, not find out afterwards.
Sure. Throw into the chat the things that you think are important that we haven't flagged at the beginning, and then we'll make sure that that's a part of the discussion when we get to that point.
So Jake, you, from all your experience, you well know that there's no such thing as a perfect model that models every single thing on the planet. That's called real life, and we don't have a model that can do that. So there are constraints to the model, which Jeremy can address, but there are also policies and laws that we have that will be subsumed in other assumptions based in the model. So they wouldn't necessarily be directly addressed, they'll be indirectly addressed through other assumptions that we put into the model that we're trying to achieve. For instance, a lot of things happen with HB 2021 and also within the CPP, the Clean Fuels Program and other things operate underneath that. And like Advanced Clean Cars 2, 100% sales by 2035 have to be EVs, and that gets subsumed under the CPP, meeting that goal as well.
Yeah, I just think they need to be enumerated.
I think if you hold off on your questions when Jeremy's done, you'll probably get a lot of them answered.
Thanks, Alan. Thank you, Jake. These are all really good questions. Let's just get through the next couple of slides. We'll pause for additional questions, and then we'll get Jeremy on, and then all of this can be thrown out there for the group to discuss because it is good stuff. Go ahead, Jason.
We're at the point, I think we're at the point we've been waiting for. Just been eagerly anticipating Jeremy here. The buildup is just killing me. All right, Jeremy.
Thanks, Jason. So what I will kick off here with is a review of the modeling approach, which we went through in the initial kickoff to the working group process. But I've got a couple of slides just to remind people what we're doing. And then that feeds into some more specific discussion on methodology components related to transmission and distribution, both on electricity and gas, to give a flavor of how that's treated in the model here. So if we go to the next slide. The next slide. So we are starting with a model of Oregon's economy. So this is a bottom-up model representing all of the various different technology stocks across all of the sectors and subsectors. So we have about 80 different subsectors that we are representing those technology stocks in. And first of all, we want to be building a picture of what Oregon looks like today. So how are customers consuming energy? What types of vehicle are they driving? What types of space heating, water heating, etc. do they have in their homes? How is industry consuming energy? And then moving forward in time from 2024 through 2050, what are we assuming about how that technology stock changes? And the way that we are building those assumptions into the model is primarily through sales shares. So when a customer goes to the dealership to buy a new vehicle, are they buying an electric vehicle or are they buying an ICE? Those sales shares are inputs into the model. And for many of the subsectors, we have those inputs. And if we combine the energy needs across all of the different fuel types, all of the different subsectors, then we get an aggregate energy need across Oregon. So the demand for electricity, the demand for liquid fuels, the demand for gaseous fuels, and those are inputs into our supply side model. The supply side model is a capacity expansion and operations model that is looking at how to build out all of the various energy supply chains. So the infrastructure components of providing liquid fuels, for providing gas, for providing electricity. And these are the investments are constrained by needing to meet the clean energy goals. So those goals that Jason described earlier on, and working out what types of investments in commodities, in energy conversion processes, in transport infrastructure, storage, and delivery are needed to get us to that point in the future. Next slide. So taking that model process and nesting that in the data needs of the model. So the energy modeling that I just went through, that's that middle bar there. We are looking for, first of all, the best available data to incorporate into the model. So these are the underlying data sets. On the demand side, it's things like describing each of the subsectors. What are the energy service demands that we see today in 2024? And then how are those evolving over time? So for example, what does population growth look like over time? What does growth in square footage of commercial space look like? What does industrial activity growth look like? And then what are the technologies that we can provide that service demand with? So all of the various ways of heating, cooling, of process demands, the capital operating installation costs of all of those different types of technologies. And if they're electricity technologies, then what is their hourly demand shape? And then similarly on the supply side, we are underpinning the supply model with a picture of what does our energy infrastructure look like today, and then how can that energy infrastructure change over time through investment in different types of technology. So what are the technology options? What are the costs associated with, first of all, capital, the operating and maintenance costs, installation costs, the representation of transmission across different geographies, the impact of different land use. All of these different types of data sets are going into the supply model. And then if we look at the scenario assumptions at the top of this chart, these are the inputs that are changing between scenarios. So the things that through the working group input that we're building through this meeting and other meetings, trying to define what it means to shift our technology and our energy needs in our reference scenario, as well as thinking about what are other types of scenario or what if questions that we might want to investigate through different scenarios here. So examples of scenario assumptions include demand side assumptions, so things like the electric vehicle sales, the impact of different policies on sales. So IRA is a good example of that, driving faster electric vehicle adoption. And then similarly on the supply side, what resource availability do we have? How fast do we assume that we could build new transmission? Is it an opportunity to reconductor existing lines by 2030, or is 2035 a more realistic date? Those types of assumptions, and then all constrained by our emissions targets and other clean energy targets. Next slide. So a note here on forecasting versus backcasting and the approach that we're taking through the modeling work that we're doing here. So in this context, we think of forecasting as projected changes based on expected customer behavior, given incentives, given their past behavior, given technology, the results of current policy. So we can think about how does our present system look like it's going to evolve over time, given incentives and behavior. And then there's backcasting, where we have future goals in mind. We have a year in which we need to achieve those goals. And so we can think about what do we need to achieve by that date and work backwards from there. And it's useful to think about modeling the energy system in these terms, because we now know something about the future. It's different from in the past, where we were often being reactive. We were building to forecasted peak load conditions. But this was a 5-10 year sort of look ahead. Now we know something about 2050, and we need to think about our energy system in the context of that changing future emissions goal and clean energy goal. And so thinking about all of the different types of energy infrastructure we can invest in, we have a certain number of bites of the apple available to us. So we're talking about appliances where the lifetime may be 10 years. Then we may have 2 or 3 bites of the apple between now and 2050 to replace that technology with something else. AC and furnaces, maybe the lifetime is a bit longer and a little bit lower number of bites of the apple. Vehicles, maybe 15 years, 1 or 2 opportunities to replace a vehicle. And then when talking about things like boilers in industry, power plants, and then particularly transmission lines, then once we replace those anytime between now and 2050, then that's probably the technology that is going to be there when we meet that 80% emissions target in 2050. So this helps us contextualize near-term decision-making in the needs of the future. Next slide. On our energy supply side, we are thinking about this in an integrated way. So we're solving for investments, not just siloed in electricity, siloed in fuels production, but the opportunities that exist between these things as well. And so sectoral integration is one of the key pieces of decarbonizing the economy as we go into the future, and making sure that we're making efficient investments in these integrated systems is part of a efficient strategy to decarbonize the economy. And the example shown here is for electrolysis and hydrogen production, so clean electricity going into hydrogen production. The model represents different pathways through fuel supply chains. So we could be methanating the hydrogen with carbon dioxide that's coming from some other source. For gas pipeline injections, we could be delivering hydrogen in 100% pure form through pipeline or other forms of transportation. We could be injecting hydrogen up to a certain percentage into the existing gas pipelines, or we could be producing fuels. So through Fischer-Tropsch synthesis, producing different liquid fuel fractions for drop-in and transportation, Haber-Bosch for ammonia production into maritime transport. And this is pertinent for thinking about transmission and distribution, because delivery of clean energy doesn't just take the form of clean electrons, but it also takes the form of clean fuels. So where there are constraints on building out transmission networks, then there is the potential for transporting clean fuels in other forms. Next slide. Our model geography is on a state basis across the West. So each one of the states is represented as its own zone. The exceptions to that are Oregon, that we're going to represent with an East and West zone. And we're working with the Power and Conservation Council on the transmission representation between those two zones. And then California broken out into California North and California South. So we are capturing the linkages between Oregon, both into the north and into the south of California. And the advantage of this, we're treating each one of these zones the same as every other zone. They all have their emissions constraints, their clean energy constraints. We have those represented for all of the other states across the West. And this is making sure that we are building out a realistic energy system, not just in Oregon, but across the larger region that Oregon is electrically part of. Each of these states is targeting some level of emissions reductions. And so Oregon is in competition for clean resources with the rest of the West. And it's representing the opportunity for building balanced, diverse, renewable portfolios and taking advantage of different balancing opportunities. The same thing is true on the fuel side. So fuels are a national market, and Oregon is competing with other states for clean fuels. And clean fuels can come from biomass sources, they can come from hydrogen that's being produced from electrolysis, and those can be delivered into Oregon, but Oregon is in competition with the rest of the US for those types of fuels. Next slide. Next slide. So how we are representing the opportunity for expanding transmission is with the Power Place West study. This was a Nature Conservancy study that Evolved produced, and we worked with other consultants, including transmission engineers and GIS experts, on trying to identify what the opportunities would be for expanding transmission across the West. The way that we are representing transmission in the model, the interregional transmission, is by pipe flow. And so it is zonal pipe flow rather than a nodal representation of transmission. And so when we're modeling this, we're modeling a potential for additional megawatts of capacity between each of these zones. And the way that this was characterized in the Power Place West study was to identify what the underlying paths were in the Western transmission network, and then look at the opportunities for reconductoring, for co-locating new transmission lines in the same corridor, or expanding the existing corridors to build greenfield transmission, and looking at AC opportunities and DC opportunities for doing that. We in that study produced cost estimates for how much it would cost for each one of these options. And this is a much more conservative study than some other data sets that are available out there for the same types of geography. So we think about NREL reads, which is also a zonal pipe flow model. The costs of transmission in NREL reads are much lower than what we have in Power Place West. And that's because Power Place West factored in the types of land use that these transmission lines were crossing, the topology, the challenges with building transmission in certain locations, for example, in areas of very high fire risk, the additional costs associated with that. So we go to the next slide, we can see a cost comparison between the NREL reads and the Power Place West study, as well as what we see on the ground from existing transmission costs. Next slide. So in this cost comparison table, we're showing NREL reads and we're showing Power Place West. And we can see it for a few of the transmission corridors there. So Montana to Washington, Oregon to California North, Idaho to Montana, Oregon to Idaho. So NREL reads, if we look at Oregon to California North, for example, $731 a kilowatt. If we look at the reconductoring cost for Power Place West, it's $2,000 a kilowatt, co-location, $1,700 a kilowatt, new corridor, $2,000 a kilowatt. So it is a more expensive estimate, but one that we have seen in cost overruns for completed transmission across the West to be more in line with the types of costs that we're seeing from lines that have been completed, like Sunrise and west of Devers. But what we have seen in other studies is that the builds of transmission are so valuable that we tend to be building regardless of these high costs. Next slide. Okay, so that was interzonal transmission, which we have a physical representation for and a potential for expanding transmission between those zones. And that's represented by the opportunity by year to be able to expand that. So the availability of reconductoring, say, is that available in 2030 or is it available in 2035? Within zone transmission is not represented by any physical representation. So we don't have a network for say, Eastern Oregon transmission or the distribution systems. This is instead represented by a pretty high level approach to estimating electricity costs. This also applies to gas T&D costs as well. It's using historical transmission and distribution costs. So dollar per megawatt hour numbers from EIA for the region Oregon falls into. So what happens is with load growth and expanded need for megawatts and megawatt hours delivered to the Oregon zones, then the costs associated with the transmission and the distribution scales up based on these historical transmission and distribution costs. We're not optimizing decisions based on what these T&D cost assumptions look like. The exception to that is flexible load. So on the distribution system, we have a dollar per megawatt hour number. The peak load associated with the distribution system is being tracked in the model. And if we can avoid that peak load, then we're avoiding triggering some additional cost on the system. So flexible load operations can help us avoid some of that. But this is necessarily high level, given that we're not representing the nodal network of intrazonal transmission or the nodal network of distribution. So it is somewhat complementary to the work that is being done at the utilities, where they have much more detailed studies on a short-term basis of looking at expanding the distribution system and expanding the transmission system within Oregon. Next slide. Next slide. So a word here on natural gas infrastructure cost modeling. So it is hard to know what the impact of declining throughput will be on gas infrastructure costs. So if we understood a bit better about whether declining throughput meant taking parts of the gas network offline, then we would have a better idea about what cost declines would look like, because we would understand the order of decommissioning that's happening. But if we are not taking parts of the gas network offline, then maybe we see less of a cost reduction associated with declining gas throughput. So a starting point here, conservative assumption, is to assume that declining gas throughput doesn't have an impact on gas infrastructure costs. So all of our gas infrastructure costs are fixed and none of them are variable. But we can also perform cost sensitivity calculations on this to look at if we had targeted electrification or gas decommissioning cost assumptions, then what would that do to our gas costs? And this is an area where if people on this call have suggestions on what to include here or data sources to use, then we would be really open to including those in the study. Next slide. And to end here, I'll just give a note on the approach in our RIO model towards transmission reliability. So the general approach to reliability here is that we're building the reliability calculation implicitly into the model. So we're not using external loss of load probability assumptions or effective load carrying capability assumptions, because we know that those are going to change over time. The conditions that will set the reliability need on the system, they're going to vary depending on how many renewables we have on the system, what type of renewables, what our energy systems look like in the future that's going to be different from today. And so the way that we do this is to calculate a reliability need in every single hour of the model and make sure that that reliability need is met. And there's two things that are going to drive the need for reliability driven capacity. One is a capacity need, so are we meeting the number of megawatts in a particular hour? And the other is an energy need. So in the future we'll have more energy limited resources, more storage on the system. We have renewables that may not be available in particular hours. So we need to be tracking the ability of a system that is energy limited to provide enough energy in different periods of the year. And so those things are being tracked, and we make sure that the system can remain reliable in every hour going through 2050. The transmission component of this is also dynamic. It's based on the available resources at the zone of origin. And so you need renewables to be active in order to be importing energy into the state. And we also include a D rate on the transmission line to represent outage probability. And so we don't count the full capacity of transmission towards in-state reliability need. So I will leave it there and pass it back to Jason, and we can open up for some questions here.
Thanks, Jeremy. That was great. We had a few chat questions pop up. Before we dive into those, let's go to the next slide here, first of all, I guess. Change this into the next phase of the discussion here. Just a high level check-in on time too. I think everybody probably realizes we're a little behind schedule, but not a whole bunch. We have a whole hour still left, so we can cut our next steps down to like 5 minutes. So I think we still have at least probably the bulk of half an hour, to talk about our reference case and where we're at with our current assumptions, whether that be the power of place numbers or, there's probably some questions like this first bullet here about the transfer capacity between Eastern and Western Oregon. That instantly kind of brings to mind in my mind, like these reconductoring, rebuilding projects that I've heard Bonneville and PGE at least exploring across the Cascades. There's a Bethel to Round Butte project that PGE is working on. There's a Big Eddy to Chemoor project that Bonneville has teed up. So I think, there's even B2H, so those I think are examples of Eastern and Western Oregon transfer capacity, just to highlight that for folks. I think that was probably obvious for some of our stakeholders, but maybe not everybody. And then like B2H would be an example of like an interstate transfer capacity. So that I'm just trying to bring it home, and Jeremy can correct me if I'm wrong, but he's essentially doing this state-by-state zonal transmission model. So we're interested in what are the transfer capacities between states. That's not like every single line. That's like these key path ratings, I think, that are probably the result of a few different lines. But I think that's what that first question is, just to kind of bring everybody back to where we're at here. And that's an example of questions. These are just to get us started. I just thought I'd throw that one out there to kind of start, incubating all the creative juices we have here on the call within all the collective brains we have. So I think Jake Stevens has some specific questions we might want to go back to.
Before Jeremy, Jason, before Jeremy gets off, Jeremy, can you go over some of the other studies that this model has informed? It's kind of an impressive list, which is why we actually hired SETI and Evolved Energy to do this modeling.
Can we actually talk about the Oregon modeling though first? I guess
this is the Oregon model, Jake.
Inside Oregon, because what I heard earlier, and maybe this is just a clarification and I missed it, what I heard is we're not modeling inside Oregon, we're modeling between all of the zones. And so while I might not disagree with how we should model how getting from Idaho and Montana to Oregon, the fundamental problem and issue is what happens inside Oregon. And those are the fundamental actual constraints, and they are essentially entirely transmission related. So can you clarify that for me, so that, or do we need to talk about how we are going to do that? Because this whole thing can't succeed if we're not going to look inside Oregon comprehensively.
Jeremy, go ahead and talk about where the model came from and where it's been used, and then we can get into the specifics about how the transmission constraints are handled in the model and in this scenario.
Can I just get a direct answer to that question though? Like,
yes,
I understand that correctly?
In a second. Go ahead, Jeremy.
Sure, sounds good. So our model the origin was back in 2018, where we were looking around at modeling tools out there for modeling decarbonization and clean energy, and there was kind of a gap to fill there, where we needed tools to be able to assess integration across different sectors and specific types of policy. And so we decided to develop our own. And actually, the first study that we did was in the Northwest Deep Decarbonization Pathways project. And since then, we've done a lot of the high-profile national studies. So we did Net Zero America, we did the repeat study. We work for most of the national NGOs on decarbonization of the US. And we work for many of the utilities around the country on planning for investments in decarbonizing their systems, including PGE in Oregon. And in the Northwest, we have done many of the recent regional studies as well. So we did Net Zero Northwest last year. We did the Washington Hydrogen Strategy earlier this year. We did the 2021 Washington State Energy Strategy. And in Oregon, we have supported NGOs. We did the Renewable Northwest study on both looking at offshore wind and decarbonization within Oregon, as well as other state energy strategies. So including in Massachusetts and Maine and New Jersey.
Are you going to model this constraints inside the state of Oregon? Like, that is the challenge for Oregon and for Portland in particular, meeting it. So like,
yeah,
we don't really care about everywhere else in the country. No. Like, we care about, like, no matter where you bring it from, it has to get across the state and across the mountains to Portland. So it doesn't matter whether you're coming from Wisconsin or California, you still have to get it to Portland. That is the problem. So this model has to address it. Otherwise, it doesn't do anything useful. So is that in the current plan, or how, can we talk about how we're going to get it in the plan? Because that is what defines the region's function and roadmaps. And this was why this bill was run, was to get at this issue. And I'm concerned that we're just sidestepping it entirely.
Not at all, Jake. One of the scenarios is going to be a transmission constrained scenario. So what if we do not get the transmission that we expect in Oregon to get the power to load, electricity to load? How is that going to affect what we need to do?
Which transmission?
Could be more solar rooftop or more distributed energy resources or other local kinds of systems that would be put in place. But that's intended to be one of the scenarios. So we're going directly at your question.
My point is, like, that's not a scenario. The core issue here is transmission in the state. You can get from Montana to the edge of Oregon and not get to Portland. There are 10 and 15-year transmission projects to get over the mountains. Those are the current constraints. That is the core reference case. And that's as the, maybe the leading expert in the region on this from a development standpoint, and certainly from getting power. Like, I've been through, 20 gigawatts of Bonneville studies trying to get power over the mountains. That is the problem. And that is what this needs to do. And I assume this is transmission working group, is to try to figure out how we're going to model transmission. So it has to start with the reference cases. What are going to be the definition of the current capacity across the flow gates on the Bonneville system, on the PGE wires, on the PacifiCorp wires in Oregon?
So maybe you missed it, Jake. The way that we're doing this plan is not the usual way of doing it. This isn't a transmission plan. This is an energy plan. But the reference case model success. Then we do scenarios. That was that chart with the apple core that Jason was talking about. The scenarios have different constraints or different enhancements that we want to look at to see what would we need to do differently if such and such. What if that happened?
And what are the initial constraints?
Transmission, and we'll be allowed to look at what happens if we don't get the transmission. So we definitely got your concern and we understand it, and that's exactly why we're doing that scenario.
No, you're still not explaining how you're going to model the current transmission constraints. What I saw was a bunch of slides talking about how we might build other things in the future. You're not describing the current starting point in the model. What are the current conditions that constrain?
Jeremy can answer that question. And the power of place that Nature Conservancy plays largely into that. Go ahead, Jeremy.
Yeah. So the starting point for Oregon is that we're splitting it into two zones, Eastern and Western Oregon. And the purpose of that is that we can represent transmission constraints between the eastern and western zone. That isn't something that we have yet defined what the transmission constraint looks like there. But that's the level of definition. It's 2 zones with the intention that that gets at some of the east-west flow constraints. And we've had meetings with the Northwest Power and Conservation Council to use some of the assumptions that they've developed on what those transmission constraints look like as a starting point right now. The challenge for us in that representation is that with Power Place West, we have a representation of what the expansion capabilities would look like between states, but we don't have the transmission expansion opportunities between that east and west zone within Oregon. And so trying to define what that looks like is a task for us to accomplish here with the working group.
That's the core job, I guess, from my perspective is, and so that's what I would hope we'd be spending our time talking about. If we're assuming that capacity exists, which it doesn't matter that you got it to the edge of Oregon if you can't get it where it's going, or if you're over assuming the transfer capacity, you get that wrong, all of this is a waste of time. Bonneville has defined a set of projects, so I like to transition this into how are we going to model that so it is realistic, and then what are the timelines going to be before new things can exist, because it's not about cost. The costs are not the problem, the time is the problem. There will be no new power lines across the state of Oregon, period, for another 10 years, maybe 15, maybe 20. And so if none of those things can exist because NEPA, Crossing Mountains, all of the Bonneville projects that are identified to date go through Spotted Owl territory on the north side of Mount Hood. They are not going to just be a snap of the fingers to permit. B2H took 15 years. So 15 years should be the right starting point. So how much do we have today? How much can we get across the mountains today? Bonneville has publicly available data. They have ATC methodologies available, inventories, flow gates, long-term firm pending queue, upgrades identified. All of that is publicly available. That is the problem. And that's ultimately, what Kem Helm was aware of when he ran this bill. And our fundamental problem, to be blunt, why this bill exists is because he did not trust that our Oregon IOUs model those things correctly. The fundamental problem we have is we're beating our heads against the wall at the PUC to get them to include realistic permitting timelines. So we're here begging you to help actually do that so that we don't just get another thing that shows that some fantasy scenario is available when there's very clear information and practical knowledge that transmission cannot be built on those timelines. And thus what we can do with the current system and cannot is really what is needed to model what the policy objectives would come out of this. That's really what I want to see this group focus on. And we happy to point you to all kinds of the right reports, et cetera. But that's the crux of the matter.
So Jake, I really appreciate what you just said. And I think you are further along in some of these discussions than others that are on this call. And I want to make sure that we're creating space for them to ask questions as well. And I have a couple in the chat. So what I'd like to propose is we're about to get exactly down to the brass tacks. When can we have transmission at what time is really how I think Jeremy is looking for information from this group. So if you don't mind hanging out for a second, let me get to some of the other questions that were asked, and then we'll go back to those assumptions around transmission.
Thank you.
So Mark Patterson asked, it seems that the gas infrastructure would need similar operations and maintenance work regardless of throughput. So less throughput raises the cost to the remaining customers in order to fund the same operations and maintenance work. Jason or Jeremy, do you want to address that?
Well,
So
I was going to say, since that's a gas question, we might as well just put up the next slide, and we can toggle back between these just to kind of keep on topic. But these might help just the discussion. If we can, like I said, toggle back. But this is a gas question, so let's keep these questions in front of people. Maybe we'll get another gas question. Maybe we can just talk about gas for a second here and maybe address a lot of these questions and kind of go back to transmission topic, power sector transmission, because it might be a little rough to keep toggling back. So let's just do it this one time. Maybe we'll switch to the gas topic and stay on this topic for a little bit and see if we can flesh out all the questions other people might have.
Great. Do it.
So, but I'm going to defer to Jeremy on that question.
Yeah, so that is our starting point assumption, where we're being conservative and saying that declining throughput doesn't have an impact on the costs, because most of those costs are fixed costs, and the O&M costs are likely not going to change with throughput. So that is going to show less cost savings associated with declining gas throughput. But it would be a question to this working group whether there are other data sources or assumptions that we should incorporate there. And I'll say that we don't, this is something that is not impactful on the decisions that the model is making. And so if we want to test other cost reductions associated with declining gas throughput, that can be a post-analysis to the modeling work itself.
Thanks, Jeremy. And then I have one more question, and then we'll dive into these questions that are here. So all of you, including Jake, think through what information you might want to provide to the questions on the screen. So John Dietz asked, will you be using actual events like the January storm to help set the, he says base case, but I want us to get used to saying reference scenario because it's really not a base case. So the reference scenario.
Yeah, so we're using historical data that includes difficult periods where there's cold weather conditions, there's hot weather conditions, there are periods of lack of renewable availability, and that is setting up the conditions that our model needs to be able to meet in the future. But the caveat to that is that we are not using decades of weather data like a loss of load probability model would do, and so it's a good approximation of the types of reliability need that we will see in the future, but it doesn't displace the need for 60 years of historical weather data in a loss of load probability model.
Thanks, Jeremy. And then I just checked and there is another hand. So I want to give Fred Hewitt, if you want to jump in and ask your question.
Hi there. Yeah, it's Fred Hewitt, Northwest Energy Coalition. Are you taking questions or are you looking for comments on the questions you posed?
Well, I wanted to make sure we got questions, and I'll be honest, I didn't know when your hand got raised. So since this was the last thing before we move into these questions, I'll leave it up to you. I can
hold off.
Okay. Jason, why don't you tee up the questions, and then Fred, you'll be first on the docket, and then Jake, I see your hand still up, so I'm assuming you want to talk too. So I'll go Fred, then Jake.
Yeah, I'll just remind folks that these are just kind of like prompting questions. I think the time is useful, like I said, to spend on the natural gas system here. So we try to minimize how many times we may walk back and forth between the power system and the gas system. So I'm probably gonna, maybe I'm not gonna call on people, but Cascade Natural Gas, Northwest Natural, maybe Nipsey, maybe, I don't know who all the folks are that have a vested interest or are maybe, more likely to have concerns about the gas system. But this is intended to kind of just prompt that discussion. So I'm happy to kind of ask these questions to the group and see if there's any responses. Otherwise, just, feel free to raise your hand or speak up at any time you want to voice anything that has a nexus to these questions, basically.
So Jason, I'm going to jump in, and Fred, you're on deck, but I missed a question and I'm so sorry. It looks like Eli or Ellie, I don't know which it is. I'm going to go with Eli, but tell me if I'm wrong, asked a question about the modeling. So either in the reference and or scenario cases, will the model factor in grid enhancing technologies, sometimes called GETs, and specifically dynamic line ratings? Dynamic line ratings can immediately increase the capacity of the grid, which, as Jake highlighted, is already constrained. Jeremy?
There are no dependencies with weather conditions in the model. It is just a transfer capability, and that transfer capability is defined by other studies that we're relying on. But it is a good question and potentially good input to the model. So if there are things that can be accomplished in a faster period of time to enhance the capacity of a particular corridor or path, then that is something that we should be looking at data sources for that, including it here. Because as Jake was mentioning earlier, the development times for many of these new construction kind of projects on transmission take a long time. And our base assumption on that is that reconductoring could happen by 2030 and any new construction could happen by 2035. But what we've heard from meetings with data holders is that the reconductoring should also be 2035. And so anything that is possible earlier, that would be great if there were data sources that we could build into the model.
Great. So I've got teed up a number of things come in. So first I'm going to open up the floor to Fred for his question. And then Sydney had another question about the modeling. So after Fred's done, I'll throw that in. And then we'll go to Jake. And then I thought I saw another hand raised, but it seems to have gone down. So, but if you want to ask a question, get your hand up there and I'll get you in the queue. Go ahead, Fred.
Yeah, this is Fred. I don't have a question.
Comment. I'm sorry, Fred. Question or comment, either is fine.
Okay. If you can go back to the previous slide, and I'll have comments on both of these if that's in order. First on electric transmission, on the first point, this study cannot give us precise answers. The model scope is not such that it can give us precise answers about transfer capacity. It can provide very general overview of need, is my assumption. The two modeling zones cannot give us the information to determine where and when exactly new transmission can get built. There are lots of other studies and study processes that provide that data. The Power Place did a pretty good job actually at a Western regional level. We have Bonneville's many studies, their path information and so forth. We have WEC, we have Northern Grid, we have utility studies by PG, PacifiCorp, et cetera. We have the new West Tech process coming along, the Connected West study that's coming out next month, sponsored by CREPC. There's a lot of information to look at transmission transfer capacity with a sufficient look down to the level of, east to west in Oregon. And not to forget that a lot of this is also, the need is not just driven by resources within Oregon going to different locations for use within Oregon. There's also going to be resources outside the state that will need access across Oregon to where the load is in various places. So I think an important point about this study that I hope Odo will highlight is that the study is not a transmission planning study. It really can't be. It can reflect other studies that are fully detailed studies, but this is an overall economy-wide, energy strategy. And I think we can learn some useful things out of the analysis, even with just a two-zone representation, about the general need for new transmission over the next couple of decades. So that would be my first answer for that. I think I've responded on the second one and the third one. And if it's okay, I'd like to switch and just talk for a moment about gas. The gas pipeline infrastructure in the state is pretty straightforward. I don't think, although, a big controversy about expansion of some of that capacity, I don't think anybody expects that any major new pipelines are in order for Oregon. Probably, maybe not ever. The last really big one, the Ruby pipeline, which is really not really designed to meet Oregon's needs so much, but to bring Rockies gas across down to the California and basically California market, that was built, about a decade ago. I don't remember the exact date. Major new lines going up and down the I-5 corridor, Eastern Oregon, wherever they may be, it seems very unlikely, especially given that our state energy strategy is envisioning a reduction in the use of gas over time. So I don't really see that as being the big issue that it is on the transmission side, where major new builds really are going to be needed and take a lot of time and a lot of cost. By the way, we don't have to wait 15 years for new transmission. Confederated Tribes of Warm Springs and PGE are doing a big upgrade project on the Bethel Round Butte line. Cascade Renewable Transmission Project is, if they can find an off-taker, and get all the environmental review done, that could be done in under 5 years. And that's a pretty significant 1,000 megawatts of transfer from the east side to the west side. So just to say, again, I think we should keep the purpose of the study and the ability to dig down really deeply in a very detailed way on transmission, electric transmission. Those are two really kind of separate things. There will be plenty more information about new transmission need and opportunities through other study processes that the state energy strategy can take advantage of.
Hey, thanks, Fred. Appreciate all your comments. I want to flag that Elaine Hart threw a clarification into the chat that kind of gets at how the model actually works on the transmission constraint level. I said I would highly recommend you read it. Elaine, did you want to add anything to that?
No, I just didn't want to take up time on the call. But if anyone has follow-up questions, happy to chat.
Sure.
And Jeremy, if you have any corrections to what I said, please also chime in.
So I've got.
Okay, thanks, Elaine.
I've got a quick question from Sydney, and then Jake, I'll move over to you. So Sydney's question, and also Nora seconded wanting to get this answer. She was curious how large load growth from data centers and other things would be modeled. It would be included in your model, Jeremy.
Yeah, that's a great question. So it's something that is really hard to predict. It lies on a knife edge of rates and other factors that drive where these types of facilities are going to go. And they could change where they put a data center in the space of 6 months. So it's a very challenging forecasting problem. And I think it's one that is somewhat intractable in terms of getting at accurate predictions about data center growth over time. What we are going to do in this study, or at least the proposal that we have for that, is to just rely on the work that the Northwest Power and Conservation Council has done for forecasting data center growth. And what they're doing is using the utility forecasts of that growth within their service territories, assuming that there is some level of overlap or double counting happening, where there will be a limited number of data centers coming into Oregon, and they're going to go to one or the other of the many IOUs and POUs in the state. And so we'll take the middle of the road forecast from Power and Conservation Council, and then potentially in other scenarios look at sensitivities on that, whether there are more or less data centers coming into the state.
Thanks, Jeremy. Appreciate that response. Okay, Jake, thank you for waiting patiently. What's your input at this point?
Yeah, I like per my earlier comments, open up the discussion and talk about the transmission modeling, how it's going to be approached. And ultimately, let's all refocus ourselves a little bit here. This is a bill for Oregon to figure out how to serve Oregon's needs inside the state, not Oregon as a big blob, it has physical geography that's relevant. Power needs to get to Portland. It needs to get to specific locations. And so this modeling exercise cannot be accurate or legitimate if we're not going to, direct it with at least some moderate specificity of where we're trying to get to. And so, again, and I guess I largely disagree, even though Fred's one of my favorite advocates in the region, with how Fred just framed this. This is not a problem about there's other things looking at other places. You know, the IOU models are what we're trying to get a counterpoint to in order to actually have another view of the world aside from one that has substantial biases towards ownership and their incentives, which don't necessarily align with compliance with the law. So how are we going to model the transmission constraints? You know, to us, like there are good publicly available information sources, but we need to talk about how are we going to model within the state? What are the policies Oregon needs in order to succeed at those things? You know, focusing on the electrical part of this for a moment, which is the first legal milestone, I believe, out of all of these laws is the 80% reduction, right? Where is that power going to come from? If there are no new power lines by 2030, then, you know, you have to look at how you can move power around inside the state of Oregon, from the south of Portland, from the east of Portland, and building things in Portland, for example, whether that's rooftop or energy efficiency or solar in the Willamette Valley, offshore wind. Those things don't have transmission constraints. So I think the basic requirement here, like, while I think I like and sympathize with the sort of pipe-based, you know, getting from zone to zone approach, Oregon inside Oregon needs to be the primary objective. And a lot of these other things become really hypothetical and really non-realistic if we're not actually addressing how we're going to get things done inside the state. So can we spend some time talking about, you know, how to pursue that? And I appreciate Elaine's clarification. I think we need to do there's a couple of things in there that need to be talked about how are we going to deal with these complexities of transmission ownership versus ratings of lines. But there's some of these other things where we still need to get to, like, what is the existing system? And I'll just tell you, and just as backdrop here, I've been through tens of thousands of megawatts of scoping meetings with Bonneville for interconnection requests all over the Northwest, all over the state in particular, in Oregon. So I pretty much know every line rating. These things are available. Bonneville will provide them to you. There's flow gate ratings, there's line ratings. You know, PGE and PAC might be cagier about these things, but Bonneville will give you all of this information. And the lines that come south of Portland, right? Those 230 and 500 kV lines, there's like 2,000 MVA lines, 1,000 MVA lines, 600 MVA lines, and multiple 150, 200 MVA lines. There's literally several thousand megawatts of capacity on the west side of the state that can deliver without any cross cascades constraints to the city of Portland. And so, you know, that shouldn't be omitted from the model. We can't discuss the policy solutions without that. So how do we move that forward and start defining a scope of how you're going to look at inside Oregon in a more meaningful way? Because I'm just concerned that and also, I guess the other core thing that I think was commented on a second ago, like, what should be the minimum? I think a key agenda item for this group is, what's the minimum timeline assumption for new power lines? And I disagree with Fred's assessment about the PGE Round Butte Bethel project. It's still got to go over the mountains. And I'll just give you one more example of the complexities of this. The next major project Bonneville has identified from the TCEP report in 2022 is Big Eddy Chamawa, from the Dalles to Salem, 140-mile, 500 kV line. They do not have enough right-of-way to build it there. They have to take a multi-month outage for the city of Portland in order to build a new line there, right? They're constrained, even just beyond permitting it. Like, when do you take down a 500 kV line to support Portland? You kind of can't. And and the same issues are going to come up for PGE and their projects and so forth. So we need some base case minimums to define when can new things exist.
So Jake, I'm going to jump in, and then Jeremy, the technical aspects of the model, I'm happy for you to jump in on, but just to kind of, as you said, sort of reframe up about what this energy strategy is developing. And first, to be really clear, this is not a plan. There will be no plan at the end of this. It's a strategy. We are not here, as far as I know, to do some kind of similar assessment to what integrated resource plans are. The goal of this is to look at those far-reaching energy objectives that I know you have expressed some concern about whether or not we're being thorough, but we're expressing clearly that what we see those objectives are is HB 2021, the climate protection program, and then falling back on EO 20-04 where those aren't covered, where things aren't covered by those. So this plan is really, or this, see, I even said it. This strategy is really about trying to understand what the trade-offs are between different ways of going down these pathways. And what I hear you saying is that there's a real challenge when it comes to whether or not transmission is going to be there to meet some of the development that may be needed in the future. This work that Jeremy's doing will highlight that. And then to your point, when we get around to having these discussions that are going to happen around policy options, I'm hearing things like we might need to do an in-depth transmission study in Oregon only to understand this better. I don't know for sure, but there's also other transmission activities that are going on that will inform some of this work that we're not going to have in time to do the modeling, the West Tech work that's going on. And
yeah, but that's where we're talking past each other. To comply with the first milestone in the first law that applies, 80% reduction under HB 2021, setting aside all the other policy objective issues like the sub 20 megawatt requirements. You have to get power on the existing grid to Portland. So you can't develop an energy strategy for where 80% of the load of the state is located that ignores that you can't get new power to that side of the state, but you can get it from the south.
It won't ignore it.
It's not a legitimate strategy. We have to start with the existing capacity and constraints. They have to be well designed to get to the actual places in Oregon, because Ontario, Oregon doesn't need the power. So a model that assumes we're going to try to get power to Ontario isn't helpful. It doesn't accomplish the statute.
Yeah.
So how do we define something that gets things to where Oregon actually needs it? That's the minimum level of granularity that's appropriate. It doesn't mean every substation in Portland needs to be modeled, but PGE Contig probably should be. And we have public information about when those projects are and what those constraints are.
But we're not modeling that. That isn't what the intent of the energy strategy is going to do. They're modeling that through the IRP process and the Clean Energy Program process.
No, they're not. This is intended to correct the shortcomings of the IRP process.
I think that's where we're not quite aligned. And this isn't intended to correct anything. And we're working very closely.
Intended to have an alternative model that doesn't have those biased inputs into it. And you're simplifying away the key objective of the modeling that is intended by the bill that will not give you a strategy that actually addresses Oregon's needs.
So Jake, this is Eileen Quigley at the Clean Energy Transition Institute. It is an alternative model. It's a different alternative model. It's an economy-wide model. It's exactly what Fred said.
You're asserting that, but that's not what the bill says. Like, somebody's presumed that that's the case, but that's not actually what the law says. So like, that's my point. If we're scoping this,
you should let her finish, Jake.
What's that?
I think you should let her finish her statement.
If we're not, what is that assumption based on is my point. I'm reading the statute. Explain to me how the statute is achieved by something that ignores the constraints within the state.
I am explaining to you the model that we are using and how it works and how it is different from what you are asking for, and saying that it has value and that it will provide the information that will enable the trade-offs and discussions that are needed for developing a state energy strategy.
And I am telling you as a transmission expert that if you don't model the constraints within the state, that you will not succeed in that. And
I'm suggesting that there are going to be and are many studies that are going on and have been done and that will be done, and this can inform them, but it is not a transmission planning study.
I didn't ask for a transmission planning study. I've said that repeatedly. I'm asking that the current transmission constraints as they exist today, given that there won't be any new power lines or very many of them for the next decade, be correctly represented so that we don't artificially assume, which is the current problem in the IRP models of the utilities, because they refuse to model NEPA timelines in there, which is why Ken Helm ran this bill. I mean, we can go ask him or we can invite him to these meetings, but that is the problem that was attempting to be addressed, is the omission of the actual real world constraints within Oregon in order to actually come up with a realistic plan.
You made your point.
We were talking with him as this was developed. My concern is you're about to do the opposite of what was the intention, and we're going to get off on the wrong scope here by omitting those constraints.
I don't know if this is going to help, but I'm going to try to move us along. I think that this model is also modeling the whole WEC, frankly. So it is going to surface so many challenges. It's going to say we have to build, hundreds of gigawatts of renewables, right? The challenges are going to be so immense and so far reaching that it's just going to illuminate all these challenges. Like transmission expansion has to be one of the top 3 challenges, top 5 challenges at least, facing achieving clean energy goals and climate goals, right? I think everybody in the room understands that. I don't know if this model is going to specifically illuminate every little, with a red light or whatever, a yellow highlighter, like every little span of the transmission segment that is problematic and needs to get expanded, right? Like just writ large, we recognize that's a problem. And there's plenty of people working on it. US Congress is working on it. FERC is working on it. US DOE is working on it. Bonneville, PGE, PacifiCorp, all in their own ways, all with their own bandwidth and efforts and resources are all trying to work on it. And there's probably going to be policy recommendations that come in phase 2 that will be addressing this at like a relatively high level. Like, does Oregon need a transmission authority? Do we need to move more aggressively towards an RTO? These are all just like spitball things that have already been studied by previous bills. They're all in the ether. They're all swirling around. Like, this was not passed in my reading of the bill. I don't know Representative Helm, but I don't think it was supposed to like single-handedly like solve all of Oregon's energy challenges, not the least of which is transmission. It is supposed to, at a high level, the modeling is supposed to inform and illuminate all these issues, right? So that everybody can kind of come along for their voyage. The people who are not as informed as you, Jake, or other people see that, okay, yes, we've got something that is like scientific. It's a model. It's not perfect, but it also shows transmission is a huge issue. Taking that for an example, right? Then in phase 2, we'll figure out
off of what Jason's saying.
To think about. Yeah, go ahead.
Let me ping off of what Jason's saying. So what we're trying to do with the energy strategy is to help try to get not everybody, but most everybody to go that way on trying to meet our goals. And in order to go that way, we're going to do a bunch of scenarios and look at the trade-offs of trying to get to our goals in different pathways. That will inform the second phase of this, which is the real guts of the energy strategy, which is recommendations about policies, programs, and things that we need in order to help us go that way on that. Maybe it's more of what we have existing of, or things that we don't have that we need more of, like transmission. And then the third thing it's going to do is we're going to have some recommendations about things we don't know about, things that we need to research, or things that we need to fix, or things that we know are going to be big constraints. There's not only going to be transmission constraints, there's going to be siting constraints, and there's going to be EJ constraints, and there's going to be all sorts of things that are going to be involved in this plan and this strategy. Sorry, Jessica, the strategy. And so we need to assess all of them. And in the end, what we're going to have is a good list of things that we need to figure out over the next 5 to 10 years in order for us to get there.
And I'm just saying that the solutions to that are in the state. You can put 10,000 megawatts. With Portland peak load is 4,300 for everybody's reference. You can put 10,000 megawatts in the Willamette Valley. You can put thousands of megawatts on the rooftops in Portland. Your model will not show that, nor show the policy solutions. It'll categorically omit it if you do not constrain the transmission over the Cascades appropriately or show the existence of those circuits. The pathway to Oregon's complying with the law is to appropriately constrain the existing capacity so that it actually can shoot out what can be done in Portland on the west side of the mountains. And anything that omits that constraint basically dooms this entire exercise to pointing to things in other places. The model won't say fix the land use policies in Willamette Valley when it excludes the fact that Willamette Valley actually has transmission capacity. And so how do we get to a place that constrains those things?
Jake, we hear you, and I do want to say that we understand your concern and your point of view. We are making that a part of our collective information setting in, but we did have Fred asking if we can move on we get this point, but we need to have others have space to have discussion here, and we really only have 15 minutes left. So I want to move the conversation on. We're getting questions about, are there other slides in the deck? So if we could move on from this, I want to ask first if there's any other points that folks want to make about the transmission questions that we have on the page, other than who we've already heard from. Great. I'm not seeing any hands raised, but please throw questions in, and do remember that I did highlight this earlier in the chat. There's a link to our comments portal, so you can submit your comments. It's a great place to provide this information. So I'm going to move on to the distribution side of things and have Rob jump in here. We've been talking a lot about transmission, so let's get down into the delivery mechanisms for our fuels and electricity. Rob, you there?
Yep.
Great. Go for it.
Yeah, so the way that the distribution system and costs associated with the distribution system are represented in the model are through essentially a proxy value that is tied to additional load growth in the future. And so we wanted to bring that up as the way in which the model reflects distribution system costs. And if that prompts any comments or questions on its own, that's fine, and we're open to a broad layer of questions. We also have a couple of little prompts on this slide that are specifically related to the increased costs that we've seen in the last few years related to either electrification and the need to, say, upgrade service transformers with electric vehicle or heat pumps. And those costs they can be complicated. They can be attributed to the household that adopts the new electrification measure, or they could be passed on to ratepayers as a whole. And then we also see a host of natural hazards that are taxing not just transmission, but distribution. And, an example is Columbia Basin Co-op just last month had about 50 poles hit by the Lone Rock fire on their distribution system. And so we have a host of climate-related hazards that may be increasing distribution system costs in the future. And the broad question is, should that proxy value have some sort of escalator for the world that we're now living in, or do we need to worry about that? And I think I'll leave it there and see if any questions come up on distribution.
Not seeing any hands raised or questions in the chat.
All right, so maybe we move on to the next slide. Is the idea to get through the remainder of the slides at this point?
Yep.
Okay. So this is the all for any other distribution and transmission system modeling inputs that folks would like to discuss. I think we've already had a fairly prolonged discussion about some of these issues. Maybe they've all come up already. And as we get to the final slides, we'll see that this is not the last opportunity to bring up comments or questions, that we actually have a comment portal open. So I think I will pause here to see if there's any other transmission, distribution, or natural gas system questions that have come up. And
I do have a question that goes back to the distribution system from Jake. So I'll flag it for, I think this is a Jeremy question. He's asking, when it comes to distribution, does that mean that the PGE system will not just be a single point? And I'm not sure I understand the question fully. So Jeremy, if we need to, we can get Jake to elaborate on what he means, but maybe you understand.
I think I understand that. We are not modeling the PGE distribution system as like a separate entity in the model. It is represented by a cost for expanding distribution. So it's basically delivering additional megawatts and megawatt hours to load is going to cost additional money. And that's based on historical costs for expanding the distribution system. So that's a challenging thing to represent, just because there is so much variation across the distribution system. You know, from one utility service territory to another, distribution costs are very different based on how they built out their distribution systems. And also within the same service territory, then you could see, you know, a range of $20 a kilowatt year to $400 a kilowatt year, depending on where you are. And so we're representing it with an average, and that's not going to capture the opportunities for specific solutions like locating storage on the distribution system. But that is something where, you know, we can note those opportunities even though we're not representing them specifically.
And Jeremy, I had another question come in. Fred asked, one more thought on transmission. Given that BOEM, the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management, announced that they are going forward on leases for 2 off South Coast areas, it will be important to include assessments for offshore wind transmission needs and opportunities. In the reference scenario, is that something that might be coming into play there?
Yeah, so the transmission representation for offshore wind is the interconnection piece of it. So we're not representing the specific need for grid strengthening within the Oregon system. That's covered by that multiplier, basically the cost of expanding transmission within Oregon. But we are representing the cost of the interconnection to the offshore system. The way that we would represent limitations on being able to interconnect that into the Oregon grid would basically be on the availability of building out those offshore wind facilities. So if it's not possible to expand transmission such that that could be interconnected into the grid by a particular year, then offshore wind would not be available until that year, or it's limited prior to that.
And how
so if that's something, sorry,
how will you determine that? So you said you'll model when it can be plugged in. So what's the basis of that assumption going to be?
It's not going to be any modeling on our side to say that this is a nodal network of the transmission system. It would be an input into the model from another source or study to say that this is how much could be integrated from offshore wind given the transmission constraints.
And I'm asking, like, what is that source? Like with each of these issues and what these constraints are, what is the source going to be?
So at the present time, we don't have a source for that information, but this is the opportunity here for the experts on this call to weigh in on what would be the best source to rely on for that.
Yeah, and I guess this is where I think my recommendation is you guys got a lot of reading to do of all the Bonneville, TCEP, and interconnection studies. There are studies showing the Oregon coast can take basically 1,000 or 1,200 megawatts at 2 points on the existing system. And then you have a new 500 kV build over the mountains, which has some other timeline attached to it. Those things are available in the Bonneville study, just like all the other lines that they're planning. So it's a good point by Fred. And I think it also points out my question about what policies are being adopted, right? There's a state policy with a goal of 3 gigawatts of offshore wind by 2030. So are we including that law and officially adopted statutory policy of the state of Oregon, or are we ignoring it? There should be some sort of matrix and inventory of that. And then we should be talking about, then how are we going to model it? I have a follow-up on a different thing, but I'll pause for a second.
Steve, can I ask a clarifying question? Is that Jeremy, what you're looking for is like specific line rating data of existing lines today. Is that what you're needing to help inform the model?
It's challenging for us to use specific line ratings because that is not, a network transmission path rating. And so when we were speaking to Bonneville about this, they were saying that it's difficult to translate the projects that are lined up into a transmission potential for the zone. And so that's one area where we're looking at relying on the work that the Power and Conservation Council has done for zonal areas within Oregon.
Are they giving you like a model with all the lines, or what is that? Let's unpack that a little bit.
So they have a zonal pipe flow model, which they are using an underlying network assessment of the transmission to try and characterize what those transmission ratings are between zones.
And how many zones are there in Oregon? Is that one or two or
3 zones?
3 zones in Oregon.
Yeah.
Maybe you could share that to look at. I'd be happy to give feedback, but the WEC model has all the line ratings and path ratings. So there's Bonneville, Flowgate, and then there's lines within the state. My recommendation would be to try to advance the Oregon model to have 5 to 8 areas where the loads are: Portland, Salem, Eugene, Umatilla, Central Oregon. You can simplify it to something, Klamath Falls, that's like a couple of the major points, and then there's line ratings between those, and in some cases there's Bonneville, Flowgate inventory, and that would give some ability to kind of get a sense of what can occur, in the system, and that work will provide more useful output than some of the 2050 stuff.
So
this is not a transmission planning study. It's an energy strategy, which is a little bit higher level than that. And we need.
I don't understand why you keep implying that I'm asking for a transmission planning study.
You're getting into specific line ratings, Jake.
How much juice you can push through the existing wires is the most important thing. Because if there's not going to be any more wires for a long time, how much you can move from where to where?
We totally got your point. You've made it several times.
So why do you keep telling me I'm asking for a transmission planning study? What I'm asking for is, if you can push 2,000 megawatts from Eugene to Portland from the south without building a single wire, and all the wires over the mountains take 15 years, the energy planning, the results should reflect that in terms of what the solution paths are for the state of Oregon.
Thanks, Jeremy. Sorry. Thank you, Jake. All the J names are getting to me today. I apologize. We are down to 2 minutes, and I do want to wrap up the last couple of slides. So I think that, Rob, this was you, if you want to jump in real quick.
Yeah, this what if slide really gets us to the next slide, which is a broader discussion about alternative scenarios. And we've put a few bullet points here that I won't spend precious time on. I think going to the next slide about opportunities to comment and next steps maybe is the most useful point for the wrap up of this meeting. And that is that we have a public comment portal, which will be open through August 31st. And there's a link on this slide for how to do that. And so we invite folks to go through the slides, go through the comments. If there are any other comments or questions that come up, we have this portal to accept those comments. And I think I may pass it on to someone else to do the wrap up and thank you for all of our attendees.
Oh, I will wrap it up. Thank you all. Sydney asked a great question I wanted to flag for everybody. Comments are due by August 31st. We do want to, though, present a draft reference scenario proposal to all of you on the 22nd. So anything you can get us before then would inform that, but we will be using all the comments that we get through the 31st and iterations of the draft proposal. So we appreciate very much your time and effort to be here today. And please feel free to use that comment portal for questions or comments. We're happy to address both.